Hey, it's 2D, and Strixhaven is right around the corner. Mark Rosewater, the lead designer of Magic, has given us a teaser for Strixhaven. So the actual spoilers for the set will be out on the 25th, or will start. It'll be like a few week process like it always is, but it'll be fun to look back and see how close were we with our predictions based on these teasers. You know, were we kind of spot on, or did we kind of completely miss the boat sometimes? So it'll be fun either way, so let's just hop right into it. Number 1. So Mark Rosewater's first teaser is quite a doozy. A white card with the rules text, draw 3 cards. Now, white is the worst color at card advantage, the worst color at just drawing cards. It just can't do it, really. But a big push in Wizards R&D right now is that they're trying to make white better in Commander. And the one way they really need to do that is with card draw. With stuff like Ramp, white also isn't very good at Ramp, but it can use artifacts to kind of get over that hump. You know, it could just use a bunch of mana rocks. But card draw, if you're playing mono white in Commander, you're just kind of boned on card draw. There's very little you can do. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is actually like what it reads like, a draw 3 card effect in white. You know, it wouldn't just be a harmonized. That still, I think, is too far outside of what white can do, and they don't want to end up in another green situation, I think. Where green, they just kept giving green more and more tools, and now green can kind of just do everything, and it's just kind of the best at everything, even. And I don't think they want to do that again with white, so I imagine it's not going to just be draw 3 card. And there is some cynical part of me that wants to say it'll be some horrible joke of a draw card, like, you know, you draw 3 cards, but your opponents each draw 6, you know. There is some chance that it's some sort of two-sided draw effect that's not going to be very good, but I'm optimistic. So based on cards like Mangara the Diplomat, we can kind of see how they want to implement white card draw. Although they did say that Mangara is not really the be-all, end-all of white card draw. They're going to try out a bunch of different things in the next few years to give white more tools to get card advantage. So it doesn't have to be based on that, but just based on Mangara, we can see that any effect that white could tax in terms of mana, or tax in terms of just not letting you do that. Now with white's expansion into card draw, those could be card draw effects now. They're not just taxing effects. So my guess for this card is it's going to be a new commander. Maybe something like every time an opponent casts a spell, put a counter on this card. Then you can remove, I don't know, like 8 counters to draw 3 cards. Something kind of like, you know, in a 4-player game that's going to build up pretty quick, but on a 1-on-1 game it's not going to do much. Another cynical interpretation is it does just say a white card with the rules text draw 3 cards. It doesn't say a mono white card, so it could be like a blue-white draw 3 cards that isn't anything new, and this is just kind of a troll, but let's assume that we're not getting trolled super hard and say that it is a mono white card. The next teaser is also a bit of a doozy, which is we're going to see a Planeswalker that we already know, but not as you know them. So this is kind of vague. It could be in a bunch of different things. It could be literally a Planeswalker we know under a different identity, which would fit with something like Liliana. So Liliana kind of ran off after the events of War of the Spark, where everybody hates her and wants to kill her now. So when she's been living under an assumed identity, she could be this Planeswalker that we know, but not as we know her, because she's going to be under this new name and new identity. So next up, for teaser number 3, we have a card featuring PVDDR's likeness for winning the World Championship. So Paulo, yeah, won the World Championship. So we saw the same sort of thing not too long ago with Fervent Champion and Dominaria, you know, having Javier Dominguez on it. So this is, you know, even further back from that, we had cards like Snapcaster Mage that were based off of winners of big tournaments. So back in the old days, these cards that featured champion players' likeness were also partially designed by those players. So maybe we could look at PVDDR's, you know, his type of play and kind of think of what kind of card he would make, but that's not really the case anymore. I think there's some sort of legal issue from like getting card designs from players, like they don't have full rights or something. I don't really know what the issue is, but that's not really the case anymore. They just kind of take people's likeness and put them on cards they were already gonna make. Like Fervent Champion was not Javier Dominguez's like card that he created and they used. It was just him on a card. But keeping the spirit of this alive by putting people's likenesses on cards, I think is still really cool. So yeah, not much predictions we can do here, but cool to see. So next up, hint number 4 is a spell with 3 X's in its mana cost. So there's one card in Magic that has this, and it's Astral Cornucopia. There's a chance that maybe this is a reprint of Astral Cornucopia, but that's kind of boring. That said, I have to believe that this is also going to be a colorless card, just because it's difficult to imagine adding a colored mana to this as well. You already have to hit 3 mana to just cast this where X equals 1. You have to hit 6 mana to cast this for X equals 2. And if you add even like 1 pip of mana onto that, then you're talking about 4 mana, 7 mana, 10 mana. So it makes a card that's already kind of hard to get additional X values for it even harder. So I think this is probably going to be another colorless card. Just to throw something out there, I'm going to say it's a Howling Mine effect. I'm going to say it's a regular Howling Mine for 3 mana. If you put 6 mana into it, it's a double Howling Mine. If you put 9 mana into it, it's a triple Howling Mine. And in most decks, that's not super good, but in some decks, it'll be very, very, very good. So, and especially in Commander, which, you know, is kind of the main point of Magic right now. So, that's going to be my guess, some sort of Howling Mine variant. And alright, on to number 5, he hits us with another haymaker, the introduction of a new Evergreen keyword. So this is a pretty big deal. Evergreen keywords are keywords like Trample, Reach, Haste, you know, keywords that they can use in any set they feel like. But this hint is a little bit tricky because there's kind of 2 ways you can read it. The first is that it's an introduction of an existing keyword or mechanic as a new Evergreen keyword, meaning this is not a new effect. This is not a new keyword that's coming out of the ether and is now Evergreen in the game, but rather is an existing mechanic that has been promoted to Evergreen status. But the way this is written, you can also read it as an introduction of a new Evergreen keyword, you know, kind of literally, where it's a new keyword and it's going to be Evergreen. And there are some color pairs that kind of lack an iconic keyword. You know, like red and green have Trample, for example, and bars, but there's some color pairs that don't, like black-blue. What has it got? But that said, I think it's significantly more likely that this is a tried and true mechanic that they've decided to promote to Evergreen status. And my guess for the new Evergreen mechanic is going to be cycling. I think cycling is such a useful mechanic. I think it's perfect as an Evergreen mechanic because it doesn't really have any kind of like flavor or lore attached to it. It wouldn't feel out of place showing up in any particular set. You know, you can kind of just put it in any set, and it's a really great mechanic when it does show up because it helps with, you know, mana smoothing. It makes games where you just end up with, you know, too few lands less likely, because if you know, you can just cycle away some of your action to hopefully find lands if you're in that predicament. So traditionally these mana smoothing effects are really beloved by players, and I think cycling is maybe the best one of them all. So I think because it's so kind of agnostic of flavor and is such a good and tried and true mechanic, it would make perfect sense to make cycling an Evergreen mechanic. So that's going to be my guess. As of Strixhaven, cycling is going to be an Evergreen mechanic that shows up in almost every set moving forward. Next up for number 6, we've got a Spicy Meatball, a red sorcery that you can have as many copies in your deck of as you want. So we've seen these kinds of effects before. Cards like Relentless Rats, cards like Persistent Petitioners that let you run any number of them in a deck. Kind of the key thing about these cards when they're kind of designed well and in a way that they're actually somewhat usable is that they work with each other. You know, cards like Shadowborn Apostle work with many copies of Shadowborn Apostle. You're not just running, you know, 20 copies of Shadowborn Apostle because you can. You're doing it because when you put them all in a deck together, you can put together a very specific strategy that works pretty well. So I assume, especially in modern day Magic, that the same is going to be true for this red sorcery. They're not going to just make a red sorcery that kind of does something that doesn't stack with itself, that you can run any copies of. It's going to be very intentionally built to work very well with multiple copies of itself. The first thing my brain goes to is some card like Galvanic Bombardment, where the more copies of the card you have in your graveyard, the more powered up its burn effect is. This is a little bit dangerous because I think if it is just some sort of burn spell, they're probably going to have it target the player as well. So making it something like this spell deals X damage, where X is the number of this spell in the graveyard plus 1, it's pretty easy to just burn an opponent out on like turn 4 or turn 5. Like, that multiplicative effect is actually pretty good, especially because you can combine it with, you know, card advantage spells like Light Up the Stage. So I don't know how realistic it is for this to be a burn effect, but if it's not a burn effect, then what kind of red sorcery would it be? To look at it another way, maybe some kind of Faithless Looting type effect, you know, discard a card and draw a card for 1 red mana. That could be a kind of effect that could kind of stack with itself without having to specifically call out its own name, you know, look for other copies of itself in the graveyard or whatever. And if you had a card like Birgi on the battlefield, you could do it for like 0 mana, so maybe you could really just churn through your entire deck. It could kind of set up some combos. So I could see some sort of Faithless Looting, you know, discard draw effect that doesn't even necessarily, you know, explicitly stack with itself, but just by how it works out, it kind of stacks with itself. That could be another option. So we'll see. I'm going to guess some sort of looting card. I'm going to guess some way to kind of churn through your deck super quick. That's going to be my guess, rather than the burn effect, because I think there's just problems with the burn effect in terms of design. So next up is number 7, and this is one for the oldies, a Future Shifted card, appearing for the first time in a Premier set other than Future Sight. So if you don't know, in Future Sight, they had these Future Shifted cards, which were these cards with like really weird designs these cards that were meant to sort of show what the future of Magic could be. The idea being that they're actually cards that will show up in the future, because as Magic has progressed on from the years after Future Sight, a lot of these cards have actually been printed into sets where they make sense. So it was sort of a look into the future legitimately, because these cards are actually being printed in the distant future. So out of the future shifted cards in Future Sight, there's still 29 that have not been printed yet. So there's actually quite a big selection of cards that it could be. So if I'm going to put my money on one of them, I'm going to go with Snake Cult Initiation. So there's a couple reasons I'm picking Snake Cult Initiation. One, again, we know the Phyrexians are running about the plains causing mayhem, and poison counters, because of Infect, kind of inherently tie into Phyrexians. So I could see this showing up as some sort of, Phyrexian teaser card, a lot like Vorinclex. I imagine we're going to get another Praetor in this set too, maybe Jin Cataxius. And another thing that makes me consider Snake Cult Initiation is, in the last set in Kaldheim, we had just one card that cared about poison counters. So it would kind of make sense to me if they did a little bit of a cross-set synergy with like Finn the Fangbearer and Snake Cult Initiation. So Snake Cult Initiation is going to be my official guess, although another card I think would be kind of interesting would be Imperial Mask. Imperial Mask is a weird card because it cares about teammates, which there's not many cards in Magic that care about teammates. It came up in Battle Bond, it came up in Battle for Zendikar, so there have been a few times in the past few years that teammates, in Two-Headed Giant and other teammate formats, that sort of thing has been touched on. But I think Strixhaven does kind of have the potential to be a set where you kind of dip your toes into teammate stuff, do some more Two-Headed Giant events and such during pre-release. I think the whole school atmosphere of Strixhaven, you could definitely see the flavor of like teaming up with a fellow classmate, right? Against two other rival classmates. But all that said, I'm going with Snake Cult Initiation. I think that's the best guess. All right, on to number 8, which is a MDFC, which is a modal dual-faced card. So a card that you can cast on either side of it, right? On the front half, it's got one card. On the back half, it's got another card. But anyway, it's a MDFC with the same card type on both sides that hasn't been printed before. So this is something pretty new. MDFCs typically have been two different card types, so there'll be a land on one side and a sorcery on the other side, or a creature on one side and an equipment on the other side. So having MDFC with two of the same type on the front and the back is something new. But despite that newness, I think the answer is pretty obvious here. It's going to be a Will and Rowan Kenrith card. It's going to be one side on the front half is going to be Rowan, then on the back half it's going to be Will, and you can choose which Planeswalker you want to cast based on the situation. I think it's just too perfect. We know Will and Rowan are on the plane. They would make perfect sense. We've already seen them as a combined Planeswalker, both of them with both of their Planeswalker types on the same Planeswalker, but now we get to see them as the same card but separate Planeswalkers. It just fits too well with their whole twin thing. I just can't see this not being the answer. So Rowan and Will Kenrith as a MDFC Planeswalker I think is pretty likely to be the answer here. Alright, on to number 9, a card sharing something never shared before. So this is a cryptic one. This isn't really 100% obvious what he's talking about when he's saying a card sharing something. It could be, I could completely misinterpret this, but my best interpretation of this is it's going to be a card with two types shared that we've never seen before. So we've seen a lot of combinations of types. We've seen like artifact creatures, we've seen, enchantment creatures, things like that. And so for me, a combination that comes to mind that hasn't been done before but would kind of make sense would be an artifact Planeswalker. We have Karn running around who is very much both an artifact and a Planeswalker. It would mean probably that Karn is on the plane, which might actually be the answer to the previous question too. A Planeswalker that we know but not as we know them. Maybe Karn is on the plane investigating, what the Phyrexians are up to. He knows the Phyrexians can now travel off their plane. His plan to go blow up New Phyrexia isn't going to really work anymore because they're already off the plane. So maybe he's checking out, Jin Cataxius has come to this plane doing something, and Karn's like, well, I got to go check out what he's up to. So maybe, maybe he's in disguise. Maybe he doesn't want to walk around as a giant robot and scare everybody on the plane with his, who have never seen anything like that before. Maybe he's disguised himself as a human. Maybe that's the Planeswalker that we've never, that we know, but in a way we haven't seen before. Maybe Karn had altered his appearance to fit in on Strixhaven. I'm going to guess that the card sharing something we've never seen before is the artifact plus Planeswalker types being shared on one card. That's my guess. And for teaser number 10, we have a Cycle of Enemy Dual Lands finishing off a 10-card cycle. So this is going to be a cycle of 5 dual lands that are going to match the colors of the different houses of Strixhaven. And I think it's going to be the bicycle lands, or, you know, the cycling lands. We saw the allied color pairs of these a few years back. They never finished the cycle, and I think it would support my theory that cycling is going to be the new Evergreen mechanic. You know, what better way to establish cycling as an Evergreen mechanic than to have a cycle of lands in here that also have cycling on them, right? You know, I'm kind of building off my other theory of cycling being the Evergreen mechanic, but assuming that that's true, these would fit perfectly into this set. They're a perfect color combination. They finish off a cycle just like it says, and they support cycling as a new Evergreen mechanic, kind of getting everybody used to that again. So I think it's a perfect fit. So moving on to 11 and beyond, these next few are going to be actual snippets of rules text from cards. So it's not going to be the whole effect of a card, but it's going to be like a sentence or two from the card to give us an idea of what one of the cards in the set is doing. So first off, for number 11, search your library and graveyard for up to 4 creature cards with different names. So there's kind of a number of different things it could be. One thing we can rule out is it's not just throwing them all in the graveyard, because of course we're searching the graveyard for these cards. So it could be something like Emergent Ultimatum, something where we grab 4 different cards from our library in our graveyard, and then we're able to cast some number of them. If it is something like putting all 4 of these creatures onto the battlefield, this is going to be a you win the game spell. This is going to be something that every single time you cast it, you're going to win the game if it resolves. So they did put Emergent Ultimatum into Standard, and Emergent Ultimatum is essentially 7 mana, you win the game if it doesn't get countered most times. So maybe something like this could exist in Standard if it is just put all these creatures into play. You know, I could see that for, you know, 8, 9, 10 mana. The other option is that this is just a tutor ability. And in Commander, the fact that they have different names doesn't even matter. So you're just literally grabbing 4 creatures from your deck and or graveyard and putting them back into your hand. And that's a pretty strong effect in Commander. That's effectively a draw 4, and drawing 4 of what you want to draw. You know, you have your pick of the litter of any creatures in your deck and or graveyard. So I would expect a spell like this, even if it is just a tutor, to still cost a pretty penny, but it probably won't see any play in constructed formats if it is that, but it'll probably be a great Commander card. Next, for hint number 12, we have the card text, otherwise put a study counter on it. So study counters actually aren't new to Magic. There's actually a couple cards from Magic's past that do use study counters. Grimoire of the Dead, Pursuit of Knowledge, both of these use study counters, build up study counters by either skipping draws or discarding cards. So both times you're exchanging a card for a study counter. And based on that, you know, if they want to keep that kind of flavor that study counters consume a card, maybe this is some kind of Alhemmerit's Archive card, a card that increases your card draw effects, but you can choose not to increase your card draw effects and instead, you know, gain some study counters. And after a certain amount of study counters are built up, you can use those study counters to do something even better than drawing cards. So lucky number 13 is actually some pretty exciting card text. It says, whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability to trigger. So this is similar to Panharmonicon, similar to Yarok. Both of these cards say, like, if you have an enter the battlefield ability, you're going to get 2 of them instead. But if you look closely, there's a difference between those cards and this cards. This card does not say your permanence. This card says any permanence. I think this is essentially a 2-sided Panharmonicon / Yarok. It's going to double up everybody's enter the battlefield abilities, not just yours, but all of your opponents are going to have their enter the battlefield abilities doubled up. If it's just literally a 4-mana artifact that doubles up everybody's enter the battlefield abilities, it'll still see a lot of play in like Commander group hug decks. But imagine, if you will, because this affects both players, what if they reduce the cost significantly? You know, what if it is a Panharmonicon / Yarok, but instead of costing 4 or 5 mana, this costs 2 mana? You know, because it can kind of blow up in your face, right? You could play this and your opponent plays, you know, their copy of Thibblethip, and they get to draw 2 cards, and now you've just helped out your opponent. Obviously, with this in your deck, you're going to be the one building around it more, most likely. So that would be kind of the way you break the symmetry, is you just fill your deck with all sorts of enter the battlefield abilities. So you'll be helping out your opponent sometimes, but hopefully you'll be helping yourself out even more. And I actually don't think it would be broken. You know, it seems really good when you kind of just think about it in a vacuum. Oh, 2 mana and double up all my triggers. But eventually you're going to play that on turn 2, and your opponent's going to go Burning Tree Emissary, enters the battlefield, make 4 mana off of your card, and just kill you. So I don't think it's going to be broken. I think it would actually be balanced if it was a universal cost-reduced Panharmonicon. So that's going to be my guess, is it's going to be a cheaper Panharmonicon that affects all players, and it's going to be really awesome, because I love those cards. They're some of my favorite cards in Magic. So moving on to number 14, we have a weirder effect that's a little bit harder to kind of evaluate, which is untap each creature you control, and then tap any number of creatures you control. So there's just a lot of things this could be. You know, maybe this is a white card where, you know, if this was like 4 mana, untap all your creatures, tap some of your creatures, and they deal damage to your opponent's attacking creatures, it wouldn't really be that good. It'd be kind of like a weird Wrath, you know, a decent combat trick to kind of give your stuff pseudo-vigilance, surprise your opponent. So this is a hard one to evaluate. There's just a lot of things it could be. It could be some kind of weird mill card where you mill your opponent based on however many you tap down. We've seen the ability to tap and untap creatures go infinite with cards like Jeskai Ascendancy, so there is some potential for this kind of effect to be very good. But again, we don't really know what's going on with the rest of it, so it's a little hard to evaluate. And number 15 is just 3 words: pay 10 life. Now, I think most likely this is going to be a Silver Quill card. Silver Quill is the Strixhaven house that's black and white. Typically with these big life-paying effects, these fit best in like a black-white archetype, which might mean that Silver Quill has some life gain synergies. You know, black is mostly the color of paying life, and white is the best color for gaining life. So these big chunks of life effects typically find their home in black-white. So I'm going to say this is a Silver Quill card. And I'm going to say that because this exists, life gain is going to be a strategy for Silver Quill, and it's going to use all that life it's gained to pay for big effects like this. One thing to note, that whatever this card is, 10 life is a lot less in Commander than it is in every other format. You know, where you have double as much life, this is just a fourth of your life instead of half of it. So whatever this card is, whatever it does, it may not be able to get there in competitive play because 10 life is a lot, but I expect it'll probably be a lot better in Commander. So on to 16, we have the card text: repeat this process 6 more times. So we've seen these kinds of effects before where you repeat a process over and over and over again. We saw it with like Torment of Hellfire. The fact that this happens specifically 7 times makes me think that, you know, lucky number 7, maybe this is a luck-based ability. Maybe this is like flip a coin 7 times and do something. Maybe this is like a Planeswalker ultimate, you know, similar to Raud Zarek, where you flip a bunch of coins and take a bunch of extra turns based off of that. And alright, number 17 is the text: pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders. So a pretty weird subset of cards, all kind of like creepy, crawly, spooky creatures. There's been exactly 1 pest in the history of Magic the Gathering, so that's the one that kind of stands out. All the rest of these are pretty typical card types that you see across most planes, but pests, there's been 1, exactly 1, and that one is Signal Pest. Although Nuisance Engine also created pest tokens, so we kind of had 2 pest cards before now. Now, something pretty interesting about Nuisance Engine and also Signal Pest is they both come from Mirrodin, you know, which is what became New Phyrexia. So maybe whatever Praetor is causing trouble on this plane, which I expect is going to be Jin Cataxis just because he kind of fits perfect, but whatever Praetor is over here causing problems, maybe he's sending out little Phyrexian pests as like scouts to collect information about the plane. Maybe, you know, maybe instead of like how Vorinclex was just kind of going crazy and running around and causing all sorts of ruckus, maybe Jin Cataxis is, you know, staying in the background, staying in hiding, and just sort of sending out these little Phyrexian pest scouts to kind of figure things out about the plane, you know, plan his next move. Although that said, pests here are looped in with bats, insects, snakes, and spiders, so it could just also be that maybe they're going to be using the term pests a bit more as a creature type. Maybe, you know, nuisance creatures are just going to be pests, and we'll see more of them moving forward in Magic. Maybe pests are going to be a supported creature type. Maybe we'll see Pest Tribal someday soon for all you big pest fans out there. But we'll see. I'm going to put my money on the Mirrodin thing, even though just based on the text of grouping these all together, it kind of makes more sense as them being literal, like, pests as we know them. But I kind of like the little creepy, crawly Phyrexian scout idea. That seems kind of fun to me, so I'm going to go with that. Alright, so we're getting pretty close to the end here. 18 is text that says, each mode must target a different player. So this is kind of interesting in a Premier set, you know, in a set where you're typically going to have one opponent. So the whole idea of each effect having to target a different player is pretty weird. I mean, we've seen this kind of thing before with Vindictive Lich, but Vindictive Lich was specifically in a Commander set, so it made sense that you had to target a different player because you were going to always have 3 opponents. So you split up these 3 negative effects amongst each opponent and kind of give them the one that hurts them the most based on their situation. But it's a lot weirder to see this effect in a context where you expect that there would be 2 players most of the time, because that means you're going to have to target your opponent and target yourself as well. So my thoughts are that maybe this will be some kind of Rotting Registrar type card, a card that's very powerful but also has like built-in downsides to it, with a kind of quirk about this card being that it'll have 2 downsides. You give one to yourself and one to your opponent. Say for example it's a 3-mana 6/6 that enters the battlefield and a player has to discard a card and a player has to sacrifice a creature. And maybe you have a creature that you're fine with sacrificing right now, so you target yourself with that one and make your opponent discard. But in other situations, maybe you make yourself discard and make your opponent sacrifice a creature. So I think that would be a pretty interesting card design and kind of a weird and fun way to do the whole Punisher effect. But a more out there option is this could be some more confirmation that a teammate focus is in the set. You know, I was talking about Imperial Mask and saying how kind of flavor-wise it would make some sense to have a teammate on this plane. So the reason that this has to target different players is that they expect that sometimes you will have multiple opponents. You'll have 2 opponents being teammates with each other and you with your own teammate. And it could also be that this is a doubly beneficial effect. So you target yourself with one of your beneficial effects and you target your teammate with the other beneficial effect. So that kind of opens up the window a bit more, where this doesn't necessarily have to be some kind of split Punisher card. Maybe it's a split positive card, and you know, in one-on-one play, you're going to have to give your opponent one of those positive effects, but in teammate play, it's just all upside. So that's definitely a bit crazier. You know, it makes more sense for this to just be, you know, some sort of effect that you give your opponent something and you give yourself something else. But hey, if I call the teammate thing right, I'm going to feel real smart. Alright, moving on to 19, we have the text, whenever an opponent activates an ability that is not a mana ability, something happens. So I think that this is going to be another foray into white card draw. Looking at Mengar the Diplomat, again, we can see that any ability that white has that could tax an ability or just stop an ability altogether, now they can actually also draw cards from it. So a card like Original Linvala, for example, which stops all activated abilities from your opponent's creatures. Now white could have a card very similar to this ability that we're reading right here in the teaser, that instead of just stopping those activations from happening, it instead says when your opponent does activate those abilities, you get to draw a card. That is now in white's color pie as something that it can do. So that's what I think this text is going to be, and I think it's going to be a massive new white staple in Commander. So that's going to be my official guess. It's going to be white card draw and very powerful white card draw. And finally, number 20, the last real hint we got here is a line of text that says where X is the number of cards in your library. So we've never seen this text on a Magic card before, and it's a little bit hard to evaluate because of that. We have to think that whatever this X is accounting for, so you're going to sit there and count however many cards are left in your library. If you count, you know, say you play whatever this is on turn 5 or whatever, you're going to sit there and count, go, okay, I got, you know, 48 cards left in my library, something like that. And I think the only way that that X equals 48 or whatever isn't busted is if it's something that cares about your opponent's library. So I think this is going to be a mill card, something akin to Traumatize, which is the 5-mana spell that mills half of your opponent's deck. Your opponent mills X, where X is the number of cards left in your library. So if you have more cards in your library than your opponent does, you just win the game. So maybe just 5 mana, you win the game in a mill deck is a little too strong, but if it is something like 7 mana, I mean, again, we have Emergent Ultimatum, which is effectively 7 mana, I win the game, currently running around Standard. And in Commander, assuming that this targets one opponent, it's really not, you know, if you pay 7 mana and mill somebody out, your other 2 opponents are going to kill you. So that's going to be my guess based on this ability, some kind of big mill card that just mills a big chunk of your opponent's deck. And finally, it's just a little bit more of a taste on the way out the door. Mark Rosewater also gave us a bunch of creature types that will also be appearing in this set. So there will be a Turtle Druid, a Bird Warlock, a Frog Wizard, a Spirit Dwarf, a Troll Druid, an Ibat, a Vampire Warlock that's legendary, a legendary Orc Shaman, a legendary Dryad Druid, and a legendary artifact creature Construct. So there's all sorts of crazy stuff to expect out of this set, all sorts of crazy creature types and abilities, and I think we made some pretty good predictions. I'll be excited to see just how much I got right, how much I bailed on miserably. Again, real spoilers start on the 25th, so that's just a few days away, so pretty quickly I should be able to see which ones were pretty close, which ones were completely off the mark, but I'm just, you know, it'll be fun either way. So anyway, this has been 2D. I hope you're looking forward to Strixhaven, because I sure am, and I'll see you next time.